In this short presentation, we're going to discuss the concept of Christ consciousness, a term which has circulated in modern spiritual circles, and we'll explore how this concept is applied to His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I, who is regarded as a Christ figure by many Rastafari ones and ones. One of the goals of this and other presentations I'm making about the Emperor is to peel away the myth and superficiality of popular religious traditions in the West. That may sound presumptuous, and we understand that this won't sit well with the religious faithful. Many invoke the fact of him being a devout Christian, or quotes of the good emperor concerning religion, that it is a necessary device for spiritual growth, and as he put it, for good life upon earth. Nevertheless, we bear witness to the facts through personal experience within and without formal religion, and choose to abstain from it. We have chosen the path of humble austerity in the knowing of the unfathomable greatness of the cosmos, and trust in the ineffable realities as we have experienced them, all the while mindful and attentive to the universal precepts of love for one and all. The Christ figure of the Gnostics and other esoteric Christological doctrines bear only some resemblance to the scriptural Jesus or Jesus of standard Christianity. Other than the shared foundational concept of a God being of love and light, in several texts, Christ is not so much described as a warrior and or judge, as he is in the Bible's book of the Apocalypse, but rather solely a being of infinite love, a higher spiritual teacher entity. When we talk about Christ consciousness, which describes an elevated or self-realization consciousness, it is rarely paired with the idea of self-defense or militancy. Here one might consider the martial arts traditions and examine the attributes of the master monks. Even from their portrayal in kung fu movies, one will notice that they are always depicted as being humble and non-aggressive unless provoked, and that they welcome and bless anyone who they are addressing, even foes. In other words, they are depicted melodramatically as spiritual masters who are ready to fight if necessary. The Asian temple martial arts practices signify a facet of elevated consciousness which is not given much attention by many spiritualists in the West. That love is the substance that provokes the conscience to act in defense of the good, and sometimes this may require the unavoidable use of violent action. We'll leave that idea aside for the moment and speak more about the origin of Christ consciousness with a connection to His Majesty. The typical modern esoteric description of Christ or Christ consciousness mainly derives from the school of Theosophy, which in turn derives from ancient Eastern mystical traditions. The word Christ is defined within these traditions as a state of higher consciousness that one can achieve through meditation practices. In New Age self-help and spiritual wellness communities, contemporary publications like The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ and others have become popular references for the idea of human ascension, a spiritual singularity state that brings the planet into an elevated consciousness. The attributes of love are elementary to the concept, as they are ubiquitous throughout most worldwide spiritual traditions and are naturally part of the process of achieving spiritual strength. Yet Christ consciousness differs from the main tenets of Christian faith. It's a state that does not require that one be a Christian to achieve it. This is certainly controversial in Christian circles and has led some to rail against the concept as being heretical. We notice something significant and perhaps surprising and equally as controversial when it comes to the emperor's attitude about non-specific spiritual traditions, that he actually showed enthusiasm towards ascetic practices like, quote, yoga and the philosophies of the East, unquote, stating plainly that these are valuable to spiritual life. In 1973, he received the Guru Maharishi Mahesh Yogi to his palace in the capital Addis Ababa and authorized the building of schools for transcendental meditation to be taught. Now, why we say this might be surprising and controversial is because His Majesty was known to be a devout Christian and was given the title Defender of the Faith. Many Christians, however, would see accepting Eastern spiritual practices as weakening or going against the faith. Not to mention, some might think his liberal stance on such practices to be audacious, because his particular brand of Christianity was orthodox, which necessarily denotes a retentive interpretation of spirituality or spiritual practice. No additional spiritual practice outside of the gospel teachings and church orders are acceptable in orthodoxy. According to an article from the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America entitled "The Fundamental Teachings of the Eastern Orthodox Church," quote, "there is nothing that contributes to the salvation of the faithful which is not contained in the church's ministry," unquote. Taking a deeper look at the identifiers that signify the presumed Christological auspices of the emperor, we can readily see two stations he held in perfect balance. One is that of benevolent spiritual guide, and the other militant defender. These two stations are necessarily conjoined as a driving energy of his kingship and of this age as humanity struggles with its greatest challenges. His Majesty represents much more than the ruler of a small African nation and titular head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. We can not only cite his unique Devatic lineage and exalted titles, but also, through his life, we learn, as one documentary narrator had put it, he's practically the incarnation of the history of our time. And further, that he is as well the symbolic proprietor of the age, meaning that his reign, which includes his struggle and championing over fascist enemies, was necessary to preserve and indeed inject a particular nourishing energy into the world by overcoming fascist aggression in the name of international morality. The Emperor Haile Selassie I fought on the battlefront against the fascist Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and took a proud, principled stance against racism. He used the occasion of his great struggle against Italy to illustrate the level of integrity and sacrifice it takes to stand in opposition to other, quote, ignoble and unhappy regimes, unquote, such as fascist states like South Africa during the apartheid era. So when we see many photos of the emperor, we notice that he often donned military attire. Now we can put this into proper context and know that this militant impression in no way contradicts the state of his spirituality, that it represents his great love for his nation, for African people, and for the world. The Majesty was noted for his humility. By all reported accounts of him, one gets the impression of a man who truly embodied what the Apostle Paul wrote in his exegesis about the attributes of love in 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7 in the New Testament Bible. Even with militant stance, all his power and pedigree of kingship, his decency and humble nature and loving manner was renowned and apparent to many who met him. There are plenty of examples in our world of boastful demagoguery by those who wish to convince the rest of us that they are worthy of worship and praise. Rare is it that a person of power comes on the scene who exemplifies the good qualities of a true sage, as His Majesty did. So we conclude that the Emperor Haile Selassie I is the prime example of Christ consciousness. There is no equivalent of state leader in history who has had such an extensive outreaching effect as the emperor has had in the world, but hardly any nowadays would know it due to the calculated efforts on the part of the white establishment to bury or sully the facts of profound temporal and spiritual leadership in the highest degree belonging to a black man. But we can go further to talk about the worldwide influence of the emperor, which goes beyond reputation, but is also numinous in nature, active at a parapsychological level. Now, admittedly, we are not learned scholars with degrees. Our presentation may be considered sophomoric and regarded as fanatical and ignorant of the wide field of African political thought, with all of the intellectual machinations that come up when discussing African progress. What can the far-out metaphysical interpretations of an individual leader add towards alleviating the desperate situations for black people still struggling in the paradigm of Eurotype supremacist systems in the contemporary era? To some who gravitate towards radical positions within African liberation movements, the legacy of the emperor might seem unimportant and nothing more than an outdated quasi-religious relic of 20th century popular culture. Nonetheless, on the other hand, it is His Majesty's completeness as a king that makes Rastafari such a compelling and unapologetic position to have manifested among philosophical and spiritual movements of the modern era. We maintain that the peoples or nations of the world would do well to look at the Emperor's complete example in order to resonate, as Rastafari has, with the royal energy, the Christ consciousness energy. Energy that is self-assured and austere, yet humble, contemplative, and deeply loving. A way of being that always promotes transcendence. Still, in our view, the term Christ consciousness even falls short to describe all that Haile Selassie represents, because some of the profound substantive qualities belonging to him are unique and, for lack of a better word, supernatural. Now, is there any proof we can provide in this presentation that spiritual or supernatural phenomena is connected to this Ethiopian emperor, that in any way impacts African liberation interests, or any human experience for that matter? It would be like trying to prove the existence of God. We can, however, look into parapsychology as a science that provides some information on extraordinary phenomena related to expanded consciousness, which points to an alternate understanding of how human experience is shaped and why we think the emperor has played and still plays a major role in that shaping. One such subject we could look at comes from the foundational work of Carl Jung. It's the phenomenological effect of archetypes. Now, according to this Wikipedia entry, the basic definition from his perspective states, quote, "Archetypes are a concept that refers to a universal, inherited idea, pattern of thought, or image that is present in the collective unconscious of all human beings." To us, this sounds like a scientific way to describe a supreme being's omniscience and omnipresence. The theory, which intuitively we find very compelling, presupposes that human consciousness is a metaphysical quantum mechanism that creates reality, or at least affects existential reality experience in a fundamental way. Now, think of what this implies. It cannot be overstated in the scope of this presentation. The king, the human male archetype, projects an energy for each and every one that shapes every life. He, the king, is already, from the beginning of each person's life, embedded in the deepest recesses of collective consciousness, and thus is automatically, at various stages, accessed or manifested, producing a subtle but effectual resonant energy. Now add this to the idea of the archetype being uncommonly self-aware of its archetypal nature, that he knows he is enabled as such to be in the deep subconscious mind of everyone, resonating the higher love aspect of himself in the hearts of all humanity. Whether ones catch it or not, whether ones utilize that love or not, whether it touches them in a way to affect their behavior, is an entirely different story. We want the viewer to let this soak in. Let this idea penetrate and come to the understanding. His Majesty's life points to a figure who is the epitome of Christ consciousness, as well as a great redeemer, not only of humankind, but of royalty or leadership itself. We want to pay tribute with this presentation to the Rastafari community at large, which has given us great inspiration through life to bring us to this very point, to be able to now discuss what we see as the cosmic reality, the higher reality of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie I, Rastafari. Be sure to check out our other videos on His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie I, and please like and subscribe to this channel. Truth Power.